I'd like to welcome you all here. There's a reason we brought you all down here, or there are several reasons. First of all, it's a fabulous venue which has previously played host to local band the Rolling Stones, of course, T-Rex, Thin Lizzy, and somebody called the Kaiser Chiefs, whoever they may be. It's quite often home to bands in the early stage of their career, and we thought this was perfect for the kind of coming-of-age tour where behavioural science kind of reaches a new maturity. There's also another reason, which is we like to actually stage an event. If we're going to spend some money on an event, we like to stage it in a part of the country where we can make a contribution to a growing economy rather than just plugging the money into yet more London. And so we actually have a vision. We were talking about it last night, and we forged it last night. We realised that the Chancellor of the Exchequer's idea of forging a northern powerhouse is completely naive on the grounds that we suddenly realised that it's all very well building a high-speed railway line, connecting the great cities of the north. It's all slightly kiboshed by the fact that northerners all hate each other. That although in theory it might be nice to travel from Manchester to Leeds at high speed, the fact is nobody will, except to insult the people at the other end. So our vision, our Ogilvy change vision, is a much less ambitious one, which is to create the southeastern powerhouse, which is a new area of economic regeneration stretching all the way from Hythe around the coast to Whitstable. So this is our first attempt at that. The final reason is it's good to be down by the seaside, particularly when the weather's good, partly because there's something about the seaside which allows you to have slightly silly conversations. It takes away your inhibitions just a bit. Some of you may later on feel comfortable to put strange things on your head or eat ice cream in public, something you probably wouldn't feel comfortable doing in Shoreditch. There's something slightly liberating about the whole place. And that actually, it occurs to me, is actually both the value, I think, it took me 25 years to realize this, the value of an advertising agency is not really to do with the production of advertising. It's the fact that it creates a company culture where you can make really stupid suggestions and still get promoted without actual career-threatening risk from something silly. And what I'd really like to thank today's speakers for, particularly the academics among them, is they've now created an atmosphere, rather like the seaside, where it's okay to suggest really, really small interventions to big problems. Previously, if you did that, I was always conscious of 25 years in the advertising industry that quite often in a very big pitch, which was all about someone's poster campaign or whatever, you'd have a final slide in the deck, which was 6 bullet points of other suggestions, which were small interventions which we thought were important. And the overwhelming rule was that 1 or 2 of these bullet points were probably just as important in terms of the difference they'd make to the commercials of the client as the actual advertising activity. The second rule was that they never got enacted because people always thought they're simply too trivial or too silly. And so having permission to make silly suggestions is a very, very important thing. And what has happened now is that previously we felt embarrassed to make them, and when we did, they got ignored. And now there is a whole, effectively, a whole area of academic discipline around understanding the strangely disproportionate ways in which people do decide and think and act and make decisions. One of the joys is that those suggestions which we always self-censored, or the ones that we never felt confident enough to say for fear of appearing trivial, some of them will now at least be tried. And I'll give you an example of this, 2 examples actually. One was just from the other day when someone called me having heard a podcast about Ogilvy change on free economics. And their problem was, they were in the United States, and there was the problem of installing smoke detectors generally in poor housing in the US. So when firefighters aren't fighting fires in the US, they go around in groups and they visit areas where they think there are unlikely to be smoke detectors. And they go and offer to install and provide the smoke detector for free, which in neoclassical economics is the whole problem solved, after all, isn't it? You do the work for free, you provide the kit for free, everybody will get one. Sure enough, they found a certain degree of success in that everybody would actually accept 1. The ideal number is typically about 3. And strangely, after 1 had been installed, in most cases, people refuse to have a second or a third, and they still don't know why. And one possible theory was they were actually growing weed in the second bedroom, and so didn't want the firemen to go in. But I just made the kind of Python-esque silly suggestion, which I would have made 20 years ago instinctively, but without the confidence to actually back it up. I said, Why don't you just change the frame? Get the firefighters to turn up with 6 smoke detectors, and then say, actually, looking at this place, I'm really supposed to actually install 5, but I reckon you can make do with 3. So you change the frame so that 3 now sounds like a mercifully modest compromise rather than saying like an egregiously high number, because you've just changed the anchor point. Now, the truth of the matter is, I probably would have said that 15 years ago, but I would have laughed and no one would have tried it. He's now trying it. I have no idea whether it'll work. That's not actually the point. We'll know very quickly whether it works. It's extraordinarily inexpensive to test. It's extraordinarily quick to test. The cost of testing it is trivial. The real difference that happens now is someone actually, I feel confident enough to say it, and he feels confident enough to try it. That's what I mean by dare to be trivial. And the second thing is, lots of us at Ogilvy Change have long believed that you could, in fact, the most important thing in many cases in pharmaceutical developments is not actually what's in the pill, it's the degree of compliance among patients in actually reliably taking their medicine. Dan Ariely has already done some interesting work on this, making the point that everybody in a pharmaceutical company assumes that you should make pills as easy to take as you possibly can. And so they try and make them as small as possible and as easy to swallow as possible, with the slight problem that taking them then becomes as forgettable as possible. And so Dan Ariely's already made the point, interestingly, that in some cases it may be good, something marketers sort of knew 20 years ago with just add an egg. Is anybody familiar with that case? Where it was a famous cake mix which wouldn't sell, so they actually made it slightly more difficult because you now had to add an egg rather than just water. Suddenly, to the American housewife of the 1960s, that was serious cooking. And the product ran off the shelves. Sometimes it might be better to create a ritual around pill preparation so that you have to grind it down and dissolve it, because then it becomes a habit which you actually perform every bedtime, and it's difficult to forget, whereas taking a small yellow thing isn't. The Ogilvy Change idea, which we've been kicking around for about 5 years, was that if you color-coded pills, for example, if you give people 10 white ones and 5 blue ones and say, take the white ones first, then the blue ones, if you introduce a bit of chunking, the likelihood people will get to the end is massively reduced. Now, this was pure hunch. And thankfully, we're now actually doing some research on this. There's also someone absolutely fantastic at the University of Warwick who's doing work on this field called Umar Taj. And what we found at Ogilvy Change is we think we potentially have a kind of $50 billion to $200 billion problem solved if we can actually perfect this further. All our initial experimentation suggests a very, very high degree of something called statistical significance. That's the other thing, is we've learned from academics how to do p-hacking. Sorry, Colin. Those of you who watched the last series of Mad Men, who watched the whole season, realized that in the early days, there were hugely close relationships between academic psychology and the marketing industry. And my contention is always they can be quite symbiotic. That actually, the way I always look at, I mean, a lot of people, Sir Martin Sorrell, for example, look at capitalism as a form of wealth generation, for instance, or, you know, I actually tend to prefer to look at consumer capitalism as an immensely well-funded social science experiment on a massive scale. And I genuinely think there are cases where, you know, consumer behavior in really trivial areas can be a bit like the Galapagos Islands of understanding consumer behavior. It's the place where you come across the strange anomalies which then lead to bigger questions. But what I love to see about this event is creating conversations. In some ways, the lunchtime and the evenings and the coffee breaks are just as important as everything. If we can create conversations between people in marketing and people in academia, I genuinely see it as something symbiotic, and I'm absolutely fascinated. So I'm particularly pleased to introduce from Caltech via Oxford, our first speaker today, Colin Camera, who's a man I've admired immensely, former infant chess prodigy, I believe, or child chess prodigy, general all-round polymath and genius whose work embraces neuroscience, game theory, and, of course, experimenting on monkeys. I think I'm right on that. And in a sense, evolutionary and complexity thought. So he absolutely covers the waterfront in terms of the things we need to understand best if we need to understand complex systems like consumer and market behavior. And what he has to show you today is something I saw when I was up at the University of Nottingham a few weeks ago, and it is, to anybody here, you'll find it absolutely fascinating. It's to do with the solution of public goods public goods problems, and I'll leave Colin to explain, but hold on to your seats. Thank you very much indeed.